depression can harm and dismantle any life it touches. But perhaps the greatest risk is in not treating the condition. Because when untreated, depression can cause complications that affect every facet of life and become more severe with time.
I had a high degree of anxiety. I felt a sense of loss of self-worth.
I don't think about anything. I don't want to move. I don't want to eat. I don't want to do anything. Just leave me alone.
Depression is now considered a chronic illness, and it's probably one of the most widespread ones, if not the most widespread illness on the earth today. And because it's chronic, if it's not treated at all, or if it's not treated completely, people's functioning starts to decline at work, in their daily lives, in their family lives.
I say that the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And that depression has to do with finding all of life totally overwhelming. It's a poverty of the English language that we only have that one word, depression, that's used to describe how a little kid feels when it rains on the day of his baseball game. And it's also used to describe why people spend their lives in mental hospitals and end up killing themselves. But clinical depression really has to do with the feeling that you can't do anything, that everything is unbelievably difficult, that life is completely terrifying, and a feeling of this free-floating despair, which is overpowering and horrifying.
They can affect the person's life. Their functioning lowers, their capacity goes down, their communication and their skills usually lowers, and they're not able to function. And that's the reason that we see a lot of patients that they stay on disability because of the job related, and they need to practically treat their depression to be more functioning.
My performance at work did start to suffer because of the state that I was in with the depression. I didn't even want to have contact with people on the telephone. So you can imagine a reporter, a newspaper reporter, trying to do his or her job, not wanting to have any contact with anybody.
Nice shot.
The depression affected every aspect of my life, at work, all the relationships that I had, and the marriage also.
When untreated, depression may severely inhibit a person's energy level and their ability to concentrate, which may lead to increasing isolation.
One of the things which people have to think about is the energy. Do I have a high energy? Do I have a low energy? Usually people with depression have a very low energy, and that shows that they are not interested in doing the things. With others, they are trying to separate themselves from the group and from all of the activities. They are in isolation. That's one of the big ones. And again, we are asking about the sleep changes, because that takes away a lot of energy from the patient. Concentration is a problem too. If people are very, very depressed, the concentration goes down, and it's a very big problem, causing additional problems.
I found it very difficult to awaken in the mornings. I mean, very difficult to get up and out of bed in the mornings. And I really just was down. I mean, really so down. But I kept it very secret. I did my best to continue as a strong, dynamic leader on the surface, to put up that front. But beneath, I was going through great agony.
Going to sleep, just locking myself in my room. I just felt like there was no escape, just like a black hole. Like once you come in there, you just can't come back out, just blackness.
As depression surfaces, one of the first areas of life it affects is an individual's sleep and lack thereof.
When you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you can't sleep, you can't get back to sleep because you're, as I put it, your wheels are spinning. All single ideas are wrapping through your brain. and your stomach hurts and you can't eat and you lose 10 pounds in a week, you know there's something major wrong.
Complications from depression can arise through a multitude of physical symptoms that not only affect the quality of life, but also mask the condition itself.
What we know is that the chemistry of the brain is such that when people have depression, they experience pain much more severely than people who are not depressed. So if two people might have the same pain condition, one of them's depressed, that person will perceive authentically more pain. And so a lot of times people will present with both symptoms. They'll come into the office and they'll say, I have a lot of pain and a lot of depression. And what we find is we need to treat both conditions in order for the person fully to recover.
What we're learning now is that people with depression are also at higher rates for diabetes, for cardiovascular death. We now know that there are changes in bone density, that osteoporosis is higher in people who have depression. So this is, yes, it's a brain disorder, but in some sense it's a multi-system, whole-body disorder. Not surprising then that people often present with more somatic symptoms than with just the psychological manifestations.
Aside from the physical complications of depression, such as energy level, sleep patterns, and physical pain, the most severe complications can arise within the mind itself.
Is there any human being who has ever lived who doesn't have such dark thoughts from time to time? Is there any human being who has ever lived who hasn't developed ways of getting out of those dark thoughts? And for most of us, those ways are somewhat efficient. But for some of us, those ways are self-contradictory. They just make things worse. And the more obsessional one is, the more one gets trapped in these convoluted notions of how to get out of the entrapment. They just go deeper and deeper and deeper. And there I was. I was chained. Everything about my mind was chained. And I knew something desperate had to be done.
Another common complication of depression is a sometimes uncontrollable anger and irritability that can strain an individual's relationships.
For the most part, people who are depressed are not violent and aggressive people, but one of the symptoms of depression is irritability, certainly, and the treatments, particularly the medications, target that symptom and help it a lot. Some people, when they're depressed, tend to be very conflict-oriented, and they get in a lot of fights with other people, and they constantly feel on edge. They're provocative at work, they get in trouble at work, and that can be a symptom of depression, and it's very, very treatable as one of the symptoms of depression. That goes away once the depression is in remission.
I was verbally abusive to people around me, and that I could very easily start isolating, go sit in front of the television, pull the curtains, get some emotional food like ice cream, and sit there and shut the world out.
People just felt like I was ready to snap. I remember being a teenager and just tearing apart my room, just going absolutely nuts, knocking stuff over, breaking things that I had just bought. I remember people saying, well, you know, why are you so angry? And I had been living with it for so long, it was just part of me.
In response to the growing pain, fear, and despair caused by depression, people may turn to external elements to soothe the pain.
So I would come home, eat junk food, all times of the night. At some point, the food wasn't enough and I would just weep, and it was frightening to me because during those moments, I just felt that this was the end of the world and I was having what I understood to be a nervous breakdown.
Perhaps the most harmful method to cope with depression is the abuse of drugs and alcohol to deal with the overwhelming pain.
Depression and any mental illnesses that we see, they have the high risk for suicide. And what I would like to add is, because I encountered a lot of people with substance problem, if our population with depression had 20% risk of suicide, successful suicide attempt, when they self-medicate themselves and use the substance, I'm talking about the street drugs, usually their suicide risk goes up from 20% to 70%.
I started drinking. That kind of got a little bit out of hand. My friends told me that I was drinking too much, and they told me to try to stop drinking, and I found that it wasn't easy to stop drinking.
I would feel so sad, or I would feel so upset, or I would feel so angry that it was just better to shut all of that off. And that was really why I did alcohol, and I did drugs. It was this overwhelming sense of if I could just fill in the blank, I'd be okay. You know, people would like me, women would like me, my family would like me. You know, I wouldn't feel like the lone stranger.
Complications of depression may begin with feelings of hopelessness and despair that may go on for weeks. A lack of energy and inability to sleep can result in withdrawal from others. Overall functioning and cognitive ability may become impaired, which can lead to increasing irritability and feelings of anger. Relationships can become strained as individuals isolate themselves from their loved ones. An overwhelming feeling of anxiety may develop, fueled by excessive worries. In the midst of unescapable pain, both physical and mental, an individual may have thoughts of both death and suicide, the greatest complication of depression.
What we found is if we don't treat depression, it becomes what we call recurrent. And each episode, if not treated, can be worse and that much harder to treat. So over time, depression becomes a progressive illness and a much more dangerous and devastating illness, sometimes culminating in suicide. People who have serious depression are a much higher risk of suicide than the rest of the population.
I really reached the point where I thought that the only way to end what I was going through was to take my own life.
At its worst, it was like, hanging on from 1 hour to the next hour, just wishing somebody would put you out of your misery.
I really thought of checking out. I just felt like I can't find an answer to this.
I actually physically went through purchasing a gun and toying with the idea of putting it in my mouth.
I had a few of those episodes that were real serious like that, and that's why I don't own a gun anymore. So
it got to the point where I thought everybody would be better off without me, because then they wouldn't have to go through the pain of seeing me feel the way I was feeling. And that's a really, really, really scary place to be.
I was gonna take a bottle of Tylenol and split my wrist or something along those lines, but instead I was like, no, you have to do something about this. And I basically went downstairs and told my dad, I was just like, I want to kill myself. And he was kind of like trying to talk to me like, well, what's going on? Why do you feel so sad? And I just started screaming and crying, and I just fell over onto the floor, and he picked me up, kind of like holding me up so I wouldn't drag on the floor, and was like, what did you take? What did you take? And I was like, I didn't take anything. This is me sober. He still thinks I was high that night when we talked, but I was just so horribly depressed.
Suicide is almost twice as common as homicide in the United States. We have roughly 30,000 suicides a year, and 90% of those are associated with mental illness, most commonly depression.
Many complications from depression, including the risk of suicide, can be avoided by simply reaching out for help and understanding the condition.
There's power in naming it. I remember when my psychiatrist said to me, you are clinically depressed. I almost felt like something inside of me jumped up. It's like, oh, thank you.
Hope for depression rests in its treatment. And the first step on the path of recovery is to overcome the stigma and reach out for help. One need not be hampered by the complications of depression, for with the proper help and effort, depression can be overcome.